When a woman chose dignity over fear. The courtroom fell silent as she walked through those heavy wooden doors, her head held high despite the whispers that followed like shadows. Every eye in that packed gallery turned toward her, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment, but she met none of them. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, the only visible sign of the storm raging inside her chest, but her footsteps never faltered. This was the moment she had been preparing for through countless sleepless nights and tear-stained mornings. Today, she would speak her truth. Sarah Martinez had spent 23 years building what everyone called a perfect life. She married young at 22 to a man who seemed like everything a woman could want. Marcus was charming, successful, and came from one of the most respected families in their small Texas town. He had a smile that could light up any room and words that flowed like honey, making everyone around him feel special and seen. Her parents adored him, her friends envied her, and the community celebrated their union as if it were a fairy tale come to life. The wedding was beautiful, with white roses everywhere, and a reception that people still talked about years later. But fairy tales exist only in storybooks, and real life has a way of revealing truths that beautiful weddings cannot hide forever. The first time Marcus raised his hand to her was 6 months after their honeymoon. She had forgotten to pick up his dry cleaning because she had been stuck in traffic coming home from her teaching job. The slap came so fast, she barely registered it until her cheek burned hot and red. He apologized immediately, pulling her into his arms, crying and promising it would never happen again. He bought her flowers the next day, expensive ones, and took her to the nicest restaurant in town. She believed him because she wanted to believe him, because admitting the alternative meant admitting she had made a terrible mistake. The second time happened 3 months later, then the third came quicker after that. Each incident followed the same pattern, an explosion of rage over something small. Her tone of voice, the way she had folded his shirts, dinner being 10 minutes late, then remorse, then gifts, then promises, then a period of peace before the cycle began again. Sarah found herself walking on eggshells, measuring every word, weighing every action, trying to predict what might set him off next. She became a smaller version of herself, shrinking down to fit into the tiny space his anger allowed her to occupy. Her mother noticed the changes first. Sarah had always been vibrant, full of laughter, and quick with stories, but gradually that light dimmed. She stopped attending family gatherings, made excuses about being too busy or too tired. When she did show up, she wore long sleeves even in the blazing summer heat and sunglasses that covered more than just her eyes. Her mother asked questions gentle at first, then more insistent, but Sarah had become an expert at deflecting, at creating elaborate stories to explain away the bruises, the distance, the sadness that had taken up permanent residence in her eyes. The community saw what they wanted to see: a beautiful couple living a beautiful life. Marcus was on the board of the local hospital, chaired charity events, and never missed Sunday service. People respected him, admired him, looked up to him as a pillar of moral strength. Sarah knew that no one would believe her if she spoke up. She could already hear the questions in her mind. But he seems so nice. Are you sure you are not exaggerating? What did you do to make him angry? Maybe you are just being too sensitive? The weight of those imagined judgments kept her silent, kept her trapped, kept her believing that maybe this was just what marriage looked like behind closed doors. Years passed, and Sarah learned to survive. She developed a system for hiding the bruises, mastered the art of lying. With a smile, became fluent in the language of pretending everything was fine. She threw herself into her work at the elementary school, where she taught third grade, finding solace in the innocent laughter of children who still believed the world was good. Those kids became her refuge, the one place where she could still be herself, even if it was only for 7 hours a day. But survival is not the same as living, and deep down Sarah knew she was dying by inches. The woman she had been before Marcus, the woman who had dreams and opinions and fire in her belly, had been buried so deep She sometimes wondered if that person had ever really existed at all. She looked at herself in the mirror each morning and barely recognized the hollow-eyed stranger staring back at her. This was not the life she had imagined when she was a little girl spinning around in her mother's wedding dress, dreaming of her own happily ever after. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening in late September. Sarah had stayed late at school for parent-teacher conferences and arrived home at 7:30 instead of 6. Marcus was waiting in the living room, his face already dark with rage. He did not yell at first, that would come later. Instead, he stood up slowly, deliberately, and asked her where she had been. She explained about the conferences, showed him the schedule she had shared with him days earlier. But logic had no place in moments like these. His fist connected with her ribs, then her stomach, then her face. She fell to the floor, gasping for air, tasting blood in her mouth. But something was different this time. As Sarah lay there on the cold hardwood floor of the home that had become her prison, she felt something shift inside her chest. It was not surrender, it was rage. Pure, burning rage at what her life had become, at what she had allowed it to become. She thought about her students, the little girls in her classroom who looked up to her, who drew her pictures and told her they wanted to be teachers just like her when they grew up. What message was she sending them by staying, by accepting this treatment, by letting fear make her choices for her? She pulled herself up slowly, her body screaming in protest. Marcus was standing over her, breathing hard, his knuckles red from impact. She looked directly at him, and for the first time in years she saw him clearly, not as the man she had married, not as the charming facade he showed the world, but as exactly what he was: an abuser, a coward, a man who derived power from making someone smaller and weaker feel afraid. And in that moment of clarity, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She did not say a word to him. She walked to the bedroom, packed a small bag with just the essentials, and walked out the front door. Marcus followed her, yelling threats and promises in equal measure, but she did not turn around, did not engage, did not give him any foothold back into her mind. She got in her car and drove to the one place she knew she would be safe: her sister's house 2 towns over. Rebecca opened the door, took one look at Sarah's face, and pulled her inside without questions. That night, Sarah told her sister everything: the years of abuse. The fear, the shame, the isolation, all of it came pouring out in a flood of words and tears that seemed like it would never end. Rebecca held her, let her cry, and when Sarah finally went quiet, her sister said the words she needed to hear. "This is not your fault, and you are so brave for leaving." But leaving was just the first step. Sarah knew that if she wanted to truly be free, she needed to do more than just physically remove herself from Marcus's presence. She needed to ensure he could never do this to her or anyone else again. The next morning, despite her sister's concerns about her safety, Sarah went to the police station and filed a formal report. The officer who took her statement was kind, patient, and thorough, documenting every injury, photographing every bruise, asking questions that made Sarah relive the worst moments of her life. But she answered them all. Then came the hardest part: pressing charges and agreeing to testify. The officer warned her that it would not be easy, that Marcus would likely fight back, that the court process could take months or even years, that she would have to stand in front of strangers and recount intimate, painful details of her abuse, that Marcus's lawyers would try to discredit her, to paint her as a liar or someone seeking attention or revenge. Sarah listened to all of this, felt the fear trying to crawl back into her chest, trying to convince her to stay quiet, to just disappear and start over somewhere else without making a fuss. But she thought again about those little girls in her classroom, and about the woman she used to be before fear had stolen her voice. She thought about how many other women might be going through exactly what she had gone through, staying silent, because they believed no one would believe them or care. She thought about dignity, about what it meant to stand up and say no more, even when standing up felt impossible. And so Sarah looked at the officer and said, "Yes, I will testify." The news spread through their small town like wildfire. Marcus's family hired an expensive legal team and immediately launched a campaign to destroy Sarah's credibility. They told anyone who would listen that she was unstable, vindictive, making up stories to hurt a good man. Some of Sarah's former friends believed them choosing Marcus's version of events over hers. She lost people she thought would stand by her watched as they crossed the street to avoid speaking to her or whispered when she walked by. The isolation was brutal, cutting deeper than any physical wound Marcus had ever inflicted. But Sarah also discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of her decision to speak up. Other women began reaching out to her quietly at first. A former co-worker sent a text message sharing her own story of abuse. A woman from church stopped by Rebecca's house with flowers and a card that said, "I believe you." More women came forward, each one adding her voice to Sarah's, each one finding courage in Sarah's choice to stand up. Some of them had their own experiences with Marcus. Others had survived different abusers, but all of them understood the cost of speaking truth to power. Sarah's legal team was small compared to what Marcus had assembled, but they were fierce and dedicated. Her lawyer, Maria Rodriguez, had built her career on representing domestic violence survivors, and she believed in Sarah's case with a passion that gave Sarah strength on the days when doubt crept in. Maria prepared her for what was coming: the aggressive cross-examination, the attempts to twist her words, the character assassination that would happen in open court. They practiced for hours, going over every detail of Sarah's testimony until Maria was satisfied that Sarah could withstand whatever Marcus's lawyers threw at her. The trial date was set for 6 months after Sarah filed charges. Those 6 months were simultaneously the longest and shortest period of Sarah's life. She went through intensive therapy, working with a counselor who specialized in trauma, to process everything she had endured and to prepare mentally for the ordeal ahead. She moved in with Rebecca permanently, since returning to the house she had shared with Marcus was not an option. She took a leave of absence from teaching, unable to face her students while she was falling apart and rebuilding herself at the same time. There were dark days when Sarah questioned everything. Days when the weight of what she had set in motion felt too heavy to carry. Days when she considered dropping the charges and disappearing to start fresh somewhere far away where no one knew her name or her story. But each time she came close to giving up, something would happen to remind her why she was doing this. A letter from a woman she had never met thanking her for being brave enough to speak up. A visit from one of her former students now in middle school who told Sarah she was her hero. A phone call from her mother who had finally understood what had really been happening all those years and was devastated she had not seen it sooner. And so Sarah kept going. She showed up for every court date, every hearing, every procedural meeting. She held her head high when Marcus's lawyers tried to intimidate her, refused to be shaken when they questioned her memory, her motives, her character. She told her truth clearly and calmly, even when her voice shook, even when tears ran down her face, even when she could feel Marcus's eyes boring into her from across the courtroom. The day of her testimony, Sarah woke up at dawn, unable to sleep. She dressed carefully in a simple navy blue dress that was professional and modest, wanting the jury to see her as credible and serious. Rebecca drove her to the courthouse, and they sat together in the car for a long moment before going inside. Sarah was terrified, more afraid than she had been of any of Marcus's rages, because this fear was different. This was the fear of being vulnerable, of exposing her wounds to strangers, of not being believed. But beneath that fear was something stronger, a core of steel that had been forged through years of suffering and had finally emerged in her darkest hour. That courtroom where this story began was where Sarah finally reclaimed herself. She sat in the witness stand, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. And then she did exactly that. For 3 hours, she described in detail the pattern of abuse, the escalating violence, the fear that had governed her life, the toll it had taken on her body and mind. Marcus's lawyer tried everything to break her, suggested she was lying, exaggerating, seeking revenge for some imagined slight. But Sarah did not waver. She answered every question honestly, acknowledged when she could not remember exact details, refused to be bullied or manipulated. When she finally stepped down from the stand, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in years: freedom. Not the legal kind that verdict would come later, but the freedom that comes from refusing to carry shame that does not belong to you. The freedom of knowing you did everything you could to stand up for yourself and for every other person who has ever felt powerless and afraid. The freedom of choosing dignity over fear, even when fear would have been easier. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned with a guilty verdict, Sarah did not celebrate or cry or feel triumphant. She simply felt tired and relieved and ready to begin actually living again. Marcus was sentenced to 5 years in prison, followed by probation and mandatory counseling. It was not as much as Sarah had hoped for, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that what had happened to her mattered, that she mattered. In the months and years that followed, Sarah slowly rebuilt her life. She returned to teaching, finding joy again in shaping young minds. She became an advocate for other domestic violence survivors, speaking at shelters and community events, sharing her story to let others know they were not alone. She reconnected with parts of herself that had been dormant for so long: her love of painting, her tendency to laugh too loudly, her opinions on everything from politics to movies. She dated eventually, though, carefully and with clear boundaries about what she would and would not accept. But more than any of that, Sarah learned what true strength looked like. It was not about never being afraid. Strength was choosing to act despite the fear. It was not about never falling down. Strength was getting back up every single time. It was not about being perfect. Strength was being real and vulnerable and honest, even when honesty came with a cost. Sarah had always been strong. She realized she just had not known it. Surviving years of abuse had required strength. Leaving had required strength. Standing in that courtroom and refusing to back down had required strength. And now Sarah used that strength differently. She used it to help other women find their own voices, to create spaces where survivors could speak without judgment, to push for better laws and more resources for victims of domestic violence. She used it to forgive herself for staying as long as she did, understanding finally that the abuse was never her fault, and that she had done the best she could with the information and resources she had at the time. When a woman chooses dignity over fear, she does not just change her own life, she sends ripples out into the world that touch lives she will never even know about. Sarah's courage gave other women permission to speak up, to leave, to press charges, to believe they deserved better. Her refusal to stay silent chipped away at the culture of shame that keeps so many trapped. Her story became part of a larger movement of women refusing to accept violence as inevitable or deserved. Years later, Sarah would think back to that Tuesday evening when everything changed, and she would feel gratitude not for the abuse that would never be something to be grateful for, but for the moment she found herself again beneath all the fear and trauma. That moment when she chose to stand up, to walk out, to speak her truth no matter the cost. That was the moment she became truly free, and that freedom was worth every difficult day that came after it.